Everyone, and welcome to a webinar by Reuters Events in partnership with Indigo. Today we're going to be tackling the topic of cultivating a new kind of crop to address climate change. This is going to be led and moderated by Max at Indigo, and he's got an excellent panel, a group of panelists together who he'll be introducing shortly to discuss the topic. Now we're very much looking to make this as interactive as possible. If you notice at the bottom, there is a toolbar where there is a Q&A feature where you can pose your questions to Max and the panelists, and we'll hope to get those answered throughout the webinar for you. And without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Max to start the discussion. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Ed. Morning, everybody, and good afternoon if we've got friends joining us from overseas. I'd like to thank our hosts, Reuters, my fellow panelists, and all of you out in the audience for offering your time and your participation in joining this discussion this morning. My name is Max Dubison. I run the Global Carbon Policy and Compliance team here at Indigo Ag. We're a young ag tech company headquartered in Boston and Memphis here in the US with a mission of harnessing nature to help farmers sustainably feed the planet. So that's what we're here to talk about today is farmers. I've worked in carbon markets since 2008 with an increasing focus over that time on agriculture and land-based activities. We're here today because climate change is an existential threat, both to life, culture, our economic systems, and I think the most recent IPCC report describes this threat pretty plainly with a pretty broad and deep scientific consensus backing it. They're using clearer and starker language with each successive report. And you'll also see in those reports that agriculture is a significant contributor to climate change. There's a lot of emissions from the direct cultivation activities, as well as the land use change and the release of carbon, disruption of the carbon cycle. But that also presents a significant opportunity, both for direct emission reductions and also drawing carbon down out of the atmosphere and putting it into the soils. In recent years, we've seen significant ramping up of activity in the voluntary carbon market, more and more corporations making ambitious commitments and seeking ways to put their dollars to work, actually reducing emissions in their own supply chains, but also purchasing carbon offsets and compensating for emissions that they can't reduce. And we've seen an increased emphasis on these high quality nature-based carbon offsets. At the same time, we've seen a lot of scientific advances over the last decade and policy advances that are really paving the way for agriculture to scale up and have a moment here. So our panel with these illustrious panelists this morning is going to dive into this world of carbon markets, discuss the offsets, credit quality, how agriculture is a climate solution, and some of the supply and demand dynamics that are driving this sector. So with that, I'll introduce my fellow panelists. We have Audrey joining us from Blue Bottle Coffee. Audrey is a sustainability manager there. David, who's the CEO at Vera. Casey, who is a partner at Bryant Ag in Ohio, and Michael, who's a founding managing director at the Climate Board. I'm going to ask each one of you, I'll call you up, and maybe give us 1 minute about what you do, why you're here this morning, what's your interest in carbon farming. So Audrey, we'll start with you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Max. As you mentioned, I oversee sustainability for Blue Bottle Coffee, including our commitments to sustainable sourcing and waste and emissions reductions. And for those who have yet to enjoy our coffee, we're a specialty roasting company based in Oakland, California, and have over 70 US locations and 30 plus more in East Asia. We were founded in 2002, really in the farmers market scene, and we remain pretty close to our roots there. Our founder was really inspired by the organic movement, and he wanted to treat coffee like produce with that same focus on quality and environmental health. And today we still lead with the conviction that more sustainably grown coffee is more delicious, and we see that show up on the cupping table for us each day and in our cafes as we brew it. So ultimately, I'm passionate about sustainable farming because ag has long been seen as a climate offender. And we know that through beneficial farming, applying regenerative practices, we can actually improve the health of our soils, reduce atmospheric carbon, and enjoy a more productive crop, higher quality, that's more profitable for farmers, great for consumers, and ultimately good for our future on the planet.
Great. Thanks. Welcome, Audrey. David, could you give us a word?
Sure. Thank you, Max, and thanks to Thomson Reuters for the invitation to speak today. I'm the CEO of VERA. VERA is a certification body, so we manage a number of certification standards, if you will. And in the context of this particular conversation, we manage the VCS, the Verified Carbon Standard, which is the world's most widely used greenhouse gas crediting program, meaning that we issue the credits that are used in the carbon markets and the voluntary markets in particular that companies can use to be carbon neutral. And ideally, these complement internal reductions that companies make to reduce their own footprint. And then the residual emissions that they have, they can then invest in projects that further reduce greenhouse gases, and they can then use as offsets. What we do is essentially the glue that holds this market together in many ways. So if you can imagine a company like Blue Bottle, when they've reduced their emissions or they've made their operations as efficient as possible, but they want to go a step beyond and invest in projects to be carbon neutral, whoever they're going to buy the credits from needs to follow a set of rules and requirements that make sure and gives confidence to Blue Bottle that actually these are real emissions, that they've been audited, for example, that they actually are permanent, that there's procedures in place to make sure that the credits will remain valid. So there's a number of kind of rules and procedures that we write and that we implement and that we enforce on projects in order to make sure that the projects really generate real greenhouse gas emission reductions or removals in the case of agriculture. And in the case of agriculture, we're kind of at a moment here where the science and the methodologies and the accounting approaches are now starting to get to a point where we can actually see potential investments in the agricultural sector as a way to promote regenerative farming, which captures carbon in the soil. So it's a very exciting time to see this sort of finance finally play a role in the agricultural sector. Thanks again. I look forward to the discussion.
Great. Thanks, David. Casey, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah. So hi, everybody. I'm Casey Bamberger, and I'm a third generation partner from Bryan Agriculture Enterprise. We are located in Southwest Ohio, and we grow corn, soybeans, and soft winter wheat. My grandfather started our operation, and my uncle, and today myself and my cousin are the managing members of operation. We have been working with the team at Indigo. As we move into the future, we know as growers, we're challenged to feed a growing world population. And we want to make sure that as an operation, we've always been very forward thinking, that we're putting, as we know that agriculture and production ag plays a large part in carbon emissions, but also I think that we can play a large part in the solution, and partnering with companies like Blue Bottle that see the same sustainability needs that we do here on our farm locally in Southwest Ohio. Practices on our operation. We are a large farm, and as we continue to scale in size, we want to make sure that we're doing so in an environmentally friendly way, corn, soy, and wheat in the past.
Great, thanks, Casey. Michael.
Thank you, Max. I'm delighted to be here. So I'm the CEO and founder of a company called the Climate Board, and we are essentially a membership-based leverage consulting firm. And our mission is to advance private sector sustainability through knowledge sharing, collaborations, and member-driven research. Essentially, our thesis is we feel like there are too many companies and too many industries that are trying very valiantly to address the same problems, which is a bit inefficient. And so our whole prop is to provide a platform for information sharing, collaborations, et cetera. We work in various verticals, including the textile industry, which obviously has a big upstream supply chain associated with agriculture as well as food. And so that's why I'm here. My perspective is a little bit from the demand signaling side. And so we'll speak to that a little bit later. But part of what we do pertinent to this session is, as it relates to the voluntary credit market put together, work cooperatively with various companies in several industries for purchasing and giving the market the much needed demand signaling to facilitate growth. So again, delighted to be here and look forward to the session.
Wonderful. Thanks, Michael. So the place we're going to start today is just set the stage, make sure we're all speaking the same language and talking about the same thing when we talk about carbon offsets. So David, I'd love to ask you to just give us 2 minutes about what's a carbon credit, what's the difference, is there a difference between a carbon credit and a carbon offset, and what is a carbon crediting program and a registry, and where do they fit into the market?
Yeah. So thank you. As I mentioned before, we're kind of the glue that holds this thing together. So when Casey, for example, and her, her team want to, leverage carbon finance, they have to go through a set of procedures and they have to follow a set of rules in order to be able to generate a carbon credit that then Audrey and her team can buy and retire and use as an offset. But between that, you need a greenhouse gas crediting program. And so basically, there's a few key things that we do. The first one is that we have a standard, because it's a set of rules. It's kind of like the Constitution that sets out what a carbon credit has to have. So I see there's a question here about how do you account for the damage of underlying agricultural assets, right? So this is a question about permanence. So if you can imagine, if you're storing carbon in the soil, that carbon could be disrupted and end up in the atmosphere. So you have to have rules around how you actually ensure that the tons that are captured in the soil are permanent. And we do that through a buffer account by requiring a certain percentage of the reductions or the removals to be set aside into an account that we can then manage independently. So when there are reversals, because we will expect some to happen, we can then go to that account and back up the credits that are in the market. So it serves like an insurance pool. So there's a number of different requirements set out around that. There's accounting methodologies, which are kind of the detailed rules of the kind of data and parameters that Casey and her team are going to have to be gathering on a regular basis to be able to report and submit in a document that can then be audited by an independent auditor to make sure that it all ties up. And once all that's done, it comes to us, we review it. If we review it, everything's okay, then the project can be approved, it can be registered, and it can issue carbon credits that then get listed on our registry. And then, Casey will have an account on our registry. It says, here's some credits. And then Audrey will say, oh, I want those credits. They'll enter into a transaction. And the credits will be transferred into Audrey's account, into Blue Bottle's account. And then they will then be able to retire them and take them out of the market, meaning they've used them. So, we provide greenhouse gas crediting programs like us or the Climate Action Reserve, provide that kind of infrastructure, if you will, that enables the market to happen.
Great, that's helpful. Now, as these credits are created, Michael, can you speak a bit about the demand side and, what companies or individuals, who's buying these credits and why are they buying them, other than Blue Bottle Coffee, obviously?
Okay, fine, sure. I'm going to speak a little bit to the demand side at a high level, and then maybe a comment or two on the trends, size of the market, et cetera, just to contextualize a little bit. But I do want to validate what David just said. The integrity of the market and the service that they're providing is critically important going forward. So, who's buying the voluntary carbon credit market? Who's buying it? I would frame it out in the following way. Purchasing carbon credits is one way for a company to address emissions it is unable to eliminate. Sort of intuitive, right? So next question, are companies serious about reducing their emissions? And the answer to that question is unequivocal. Yes. As we go forward, less greenwashing, more accountability, more transparency. We work with a lot of companies who are wringing their hands and really trying to figure out how to make, not just set goals, but to track towards actually achieving them. And so the next question is reducing emissions an easy path? It is, of course, not at all. Scope 1, Scope 2, and particularly Scope 3 emissions reduction is extremely challenging. And most of the industries that we work with have a very high ratio of Scope 3 to Scope 1 and 2. And so the biggest part of that emissions reduction path is really tricky. And there's an innovation gap. There's more technology, more innovation needs to happen. Ergo, the carbon credit market and the need for the ongoing need for on the demand side is incredibly important. And so trends, and I'll wrap this up quickly. From a trend standpoint, it's sort of a good news, bad news, eye-popping news. The good news is that the credit market, the carbon credit market has been growing. It's doubled since 2017. As I'm sure many of the listeners know, in 2019, it was roughly 100 million metric tons, $300 million value. That's all great. The bad news, obviously, is this is but a drop in the global GHG bucket of 0.2%. And so it's really insignificant at this point. And there are a number of reasons for that we needn't get into. But it's a fragmented, complex, inefficient, poorly arbitraged market right now. And so that's the bad news. The eye-popping news is the expectation of growth. And just to be clear, the estimates, baseline estimates are that the market could grow to 20, 30 times by 2030. And so that's, the 1.5 or 2 gigatons expected. These are not outlier, sort of estimates. This is sort of where, people expect the market to go. And so this is an enormous amount. This market, when we start talking about numbers that large, that tends to attract, one thing the US market does well, it allocates capital. So the expectation is the voluntary carbon market is going to grow dramatically in the next 10 years. And in order for that to happen effectively, issues that David is talking about and the rest of us here have to get, transparency, liquidity, good demand signaling. All of the elements of a viable market need to be put in place. So it's very exciting and very pertinent.
That's great. Thank you, Michael. One thing I heard you mention early on is about integrity and tying into some of the comments that David made around what his organization does in terms of setting standards. I'm interested, Audrey, from the buyer's perspective, as you think about quality of the credits that you buy. How do you guys think about that? How do you assess credits? What does high quality mean to you, and why do you think that it matters?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to first acknowledge what David and Michael have shared, that our first priority is reducing emissions within our footprint, and of course, also looking at our value chain and carbon removals there. But we do need tools like carbon credits that are high quality verified schemes to offset the unabated emissions. And so for high quality, we really are looking at credits that are issued on the registries. It's kind of like the 4 major registries, one of which represented here today with David and Vera, the Verified Carbon Standard. And what this guarantees for us is 4 things. The first is that these credits are backed by the science, they're measurable. The second is these are permanent reductions, so they're not going to be reversed in a few years' time. And there are auditing, kind of monitoring and verification mechanisms to ensure that. The third is that this is additional, so it's not business as usual. Without the carbon market, we would not see these reductions or removals take place. And we can look at that against a baseline management plan. And then lastly is that these credits are retired after assignment. And so we avoid double counting. And if we are truly going to work together as an international community toward this, the 1.5 degree pathway future, we need to make sure we're not sharing the credit here. So ultimately, those four that we're looking at is measurability, permanence, additionality, and retirement.
Great, that's really helpful. So I think we've got a good base of carbon credits and what they mean and what we're looking for. Let's turn a little bit more towards the agricultural side of things. And Casey, I'd like to bring you in to talk about what is the actual action that we're talking about? What is it that farmers need to do to generate carbon credits through these programs? And beyond climate benefits, do you see any other impacts to the farm operation or to the land?
Yeah, so I really look at this when we talk about sustainability or regenerative practices on the farm, and a couple different pillars. One being the ability to reduce the tillage or the amount that we're working the soil. Secondly, reducing inputs and or challenging ourselves to make sure that the way that we're utilizing inputs is really being put out on the fields when they are needed and when they're most beneficial to the crop. Third, having a growing species out on the farm year round, whether that's in the form of cover crops and or rotating the species of crops that we are deploying in the fields to help build the organic matter on the farm and, like I said earlier, have a living organism that's there, a living plant that's constantly utilizing the atmospheric carbon. And then finally, livestock grazing is another way that we can look at introducing regenerative practices into the production ag community. And so basically we've challenged ourselves. The big thing is all these, maybe for somebody that doesn't come from the ag community, the four things that I just mentioned, you're probably asking yourselves, okay, Bryant Ag, why don't you just deploy all of these things? Like I mentioned in my opening statements, we're still challenged with this from the other end of the spectrum to make sure that we're producing a high yielding crop. There are more and more people introduced on the face of the earth every day. And when we introduce these new changes to our workflow, the fear is that we will take a step backwards and it will affect yield or the amount of bushels that we're able to produce. So different areas of the United States or across the world require different knowledge of what would work best in our area. So what we do in Southwest Ohio when it comes to cover cropping and or reducing tillage is going to be very different than what you would see on a farm in Mississippi or in New York. So the fact is that we also only get to plant and harvest one time a year. So we're new in this process. We try new things on our own operation. Some have worked for us and some haven't. And so it takes time for us to learn about what processes and procedures work best for our operation, and then to be able to scale those across, all the acres that we're farming today. We have reduced tillage on our own operation, and we have introduced cover cropping. And we do produce a lot of winter wheat, so we have a lot of acres that have a crop that's growing year round. Agronomic benefits that we've seen so far just from having that cover crop out there has been weed suppression. So that's been a positive in the sense of we're hoping that as time goes on, we're able to combat some of these weed pressures that we've seen that maybe we haven't been able to with chemistries. Secondly, with working ground less from a financial and economic standpoint, it has allowed us to save time, fuel, hours on our machinery, labor costs. But most importantly, it's allowing us to, we've experienced climate change just in our local area. We have a lot of heavy rainfalls. The amount of rainfall that we receive annually in Southwest Ohio has stayed the same. The way that it comes has changed. So we've started to see a loss of topsoil. So with us being able to transition to some of our farms to no-till, that's allowed us to make sure that we're not, with these heavy rainfalls, losing that topsoil, and that topsoil is there to help produce a more productive and high yielding crop as well. So not only have we been able to partner with companies like I mentioned earlier, like Blue Bottle, Indigo, to introduce sustainable practices from a carbon standpoint that benefit our operation, but we are seeing an agronomic benefit as well.
That's really interesting. And I think your comments about the heterogeneity of agriculture are really important. I mean, there's so many reasons that this sector is very different from industrial and energy sectors that have kind of dominated the early days of the carbon market. I've got one more follow-up question for you. On your farm, as you've adopted some of these practices, did you do all this at once? Or was this sort of a gradual transition of trying things over time?
Yeah, like I said, we're pretty early in the stages. This going into 2022 will be our third year of adopting some of these new practices. So we definitely have tiptoed into this. We cover about 20,000 acres in Southwest Ohio, and we've deployed about 500 acres a year of these practices that I've mentioned. So it is a small percentage of the farms that we're farming. But like I mentioned earlier, we want to make sure that as we deploy these new practices that we're doing it right. And it's in a way that we're thinking long-term so that we can scale this across. Eventually, the goal would be all acres, but we're not doing so in a way where we aren't able to continue into the future. So our goal is to continue into the future across all acres, just making sure that we're deploying so in a way that's efficient and manageable.
Great, thanks. You know, David, from the policy and technical side, as you look to create a structure where, you know, activities that Casey just described can be used to generate carbon credits, how do you see ag projects being unique from other sectors in the carbon market, like, you know, energy and industrial, or even forestry that people may be already familiar with?
Yeah, there's a couple of features or, you know, characteristics of these projects which I think will be of interest to a number of, you know, potential buyers like Blue Bottle. One, I think, is the fact that you're working with farmers, right? And I think there's a very important link that pretty much every country, and certainly here in the US, we have with the farming community. So to be able to support the farming community is going to be really, really important in helping them with this transition to a more sustainable agricultural system. And I think that's really important. What we've seen over time is that the accounting methodology, you know, enables this to be a gradual transition, as Casey just mentioned. So you don't all have to do it all at once, and you can try one practice. If that works, you can add other practice. So the new accounting methodology that we just approved, you know, in the last year, I think, that was developed by Indigo with a number of kind of experts and scientists, helps to, you know, try to thread that needle to bring in this kind of sector, and to enable the sector to be able to leverage carbon finance. And I think the other key thing is that, you know, these kinds of projects have been very difficult to do simply because of the aggregation, because you have to go farmer by farmer. So that's really hard. There's a lot of transaction costs involved in that, and it's very complicated. So I think, you know, we're starting to see the evolution of this market so that you can actually see, you know, get these projects on the ground, and that's very exciting. And then the final thing I would say, well, there's two more things. The other one is that, you know, in addition to working with the farming community, these projects end up generating a lot of very important adaptation benefits or non-carbon benefits. So, you know, soil retention, or sorry, you know, water retention in the soil, and moisture, which is really critical. Actually providing more habitat for species. There's some evidence that these kinds of practices really help farms deal with flooding and extreme weather events as well. So there's a number of other benefits which I think are really important that can actually be actually documented and reported, and will be very important as the sector starts to grow. And then the final one I'd say is that there's an increasing interest and emphasis on removals, meaning drawing down atmospheric carbon from the atmosphere. And the only way that we are credibly going to reach the goals of the Paris target is if we kind of reduce emissions now, but also start to invest in projects that are removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And of course, by pulling it into the soil, you're doing that. So it's a very unique kind of project. Now, one more final thing, this takes time. right? It's not like you can't just press a button and all of a sudden you've got your emission reductions or your removals. It takes time for the nature to work its way to kind of pull the carbon into the soil. And so there's enough of it that you can actually measure it and report it, et cetera. So these things are complicated, they take time, but they're a very unique feature and a very unique kind of project that really has the opportunity to really help us address the climate crisis.
Great, that's helpful. Thanks, David. So Audrey, turning back to the sort of buyer side here, we heard about your quality criteria that you're seeking in credits, and would like to hear a little bit more about Blue Bottle's interest in agricultural carbon credits, and what brought you to buying ag credits, and where's your interest there?
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of what I shared earlier about quality is really a baseline for us, but when we're going into purchase carbon credits, we're looking for relevance and additionality. Relevance is looking at the demand we are placing on our physical environment. Starting there, if we cannot reduce, how can we start to tackle the negative externalities of the parts of our business that are continuing to emit? And we see this as our responsibility. So for coffee farming, we know that our on-farm emissions, we estimate to be approximately half of the emissions of our global cafe operations. So pretty sizable, as Michael mentioned earlier. Fashion, food and bev, these industries with large agricultural supply chains often have an outsized scope 3. So agricultural carbon credits are highly relevant to our business. To give a specific example of how relevance has come to play at Blue Bottle already, in 2020, we saw the shutdown temporarily of cafes due to the pandemic, and quickly our e-commerce business took off. And so we decided to address the emissions associated with shipping our e-commerce goods throughout the United States, and we offset those emissions through carbon credits that supported a methane digester on a dairy farm in Michigan. We know that our most popular beverage in cafes is the latte, and the cappuccino is right up there, and those are very milk-heavy drinks, and dairy has a large footprint. So that's an example of relevance when we're looking at carbon credits. And the second piece I mentioned was additionality, and this is different than kind of the baseline additionality that these credits are not business as usual, but I'm talking about co-benefits. This is increasingly relevant to buyers who are making commitments to be climate neutral or climate positive. You hear these new terms that are expanding the definition of how we seek to be good stewards of the natural environment, to include those metrics beyond carbon accounting, such as biodiversity or water usage scores. Companies are also looking for credits that have positive community impacts, such as job creation, and that align with corporate equity standards as well. So the carbon offsets, to go back to the example earlier that I mentioned around the methane digester at the dairy, in that community, the excess methane captured supplied the farm's electricity, and with the remainder sold to the grid, that was sold to the grid to power 600 homes in the surrounding community. And for Indigo, we see numerous co-benefits that are critical to securing our food systems. And this includes improving drought tolerance and flood resistance, producing more nutritious crops, enhancing yields, decreasing inputs required. Casey already went through some of the benefits they're seeing as a result of topsoil erosion, and how they can cover crops can help prevent against that. So this is, the co-benefits are really important, and some businesses even see this as risk mitigation as well, reducing the vulnerability in supply streams through powerful carbon credits. So yeah.
That's great. That's really helpful to hear. And I love those dairy digester projects too. I worked on those for a long time in a past life. So sort of building on that, Michael, can you speak more about what's driving demand for ag carbon credits in general, trends that you see, and a couple of specific questions. one, where do you see demand for ag carbon compared to, voluntary credits more broadly? Higher, lower, no difference. And then, as you work with other companies, do you see a lot of other companies approaching this in the way Blue Bottle is approaching this, with such sort of thought and consideration?
Yeah, so there's some degree of variability in corporate behavior with regard to deploying tactics. Obviously, the big focus is on carbon reduction, the company's carbon footprint itself. But the demand is, these companies are a couple of things. One is particularly in the apparel industry, where we obviously do a lot of large brand companies. The stakeholder ownership model. These companies have to be really motivated to make sure that they are getting not just reducing their emissions, but putting a comprehensive story together about the impact on the environment that they can share with their customers, who are fairly, some of these apparel companies, the customers are fairly active, right? And so more specifically to your question, one thing to note is that the nature-based solutions or carbon credits, if you look at 2019 on a per ton basis, go for a much higher price than, say, the renewable energy carbon credits, which is by volume was much larger in 2019, but by dollar volume was considerably smaller. And so they tend to be higher priced, higher quality, which is good. I think the potential demand is enormous, as I mentioned earlier. You even have companies now like engaging in doing carbon insets, right? And so it's more than it's for a lot of these companies. The demand is driven more not just by the contribution to the emission reduction argument, but managing the Scope 3 supply chain. And it's, as David said, it's hard to scale, because if you talk about apparel and cotton's grown in Brazil and India and US and Europe, and it's a very, very difficult supply chain to manage. And so they're really struggling to figure out how to do that. My point is, where, for example, Indigo, I think, is looking to go and intermediate, could be a huge, huge benefit for companies looking to be not just purchase carbon credits, but be more proactive in managing that upstream supply chain. And I'm sort of a market person. Unleashing the capital, some corporate capital into this area, I think, is going to be critically important. Not just purchasing, but deploying capital up the supply chain for carbon insets. There are even companies we're working with that are using an internal carbon price for the purpose of their capital expenditure, think through. And some companies using a $5 price, some companies using $50 price. It's somewhat arbitrary at this point, but you can see that mentality where the economics of carbon pricing is infusing its way into corporate decision making, which is intriguing, and I think will be part of the unleashing the capital on the demand side. If that isn't too obtuse or doesn't make sense. So I'm a huge fan of what you're doing at Indigo, and trying to introduce better intermediation activities that can make it easier for companies to not just purchase carbon credits, but deploy more capital up the supply chain along these lines.
That's really interesting. And I'm curious, when you talk about companies using internal carbon pricing, do they typically then literally collect, an account of money based on that carbon price and then deploy that for climate solutions? Or, how does that sort of end up getting used?
It varies. Some of it is what if, right? They're looking at a capital expenditure program to invest in XYZ. If we included the carbon price into this project, would it clear our investment hurdles? And so some of it's a counterfactual approach to sort of drive thinking, though there are companies that are actually doing it. And so, yeah, they don't, or the way they qualify suppliers. Does a supplier, there are that infusion into the decision making of capital deployment in companies increasingly taking into consideration carbon pricing and broader environmental impact is how I would answer that.
Gotcha. So then thinking about the supply side, Casey, I'm curious, how are things going for farmers, and what's the outlook from the farm? Are farmers interested? Are they adopting new practices? What do you hear from others like yourself that are kind of tiptoeing into this and trying it out?
Yeah, I mean, I can only speak on behalf of our farm and local growers, or some friends that I have across the farming community. I think the biggest hurdle right now is like we talked about earlier in this session. The space is a little bit messy right now. Understanding the marketplace and how these credits are going to be verified and what's going to be required from the individual farmers. There's not a lot of people, and I can only again speak on my experience, where in my area there's not a lot of cover crops that are grown. So the process of understanding what species would work best on my operation based on my weather patterns, my soil types, and the crops that I was growing behind the cover crops was very limited. So there's a lot of time and money and effort spent on educating the processes that are going to work best for my geographical area. Secondly, there's a lot of capital in order to deploy this on a mass amount of acres that has to be put up in switching our equipment. For example, our planters today are not set up for no-till ground. So that's an additional cost that I would assume with my operation, if we were to become completely no-till, to make sure that my planters on our operation today are set up to be able to plant into a harder soil. So those are just things that when we start to look at including the carbon market into our operation and what additional income that brings to our operation, we also have to look at the other side. And we know that this is better practices. We know that there are agronomic benefits, but we have to make sure that the cost of switching into more regenerative practices is also beneficial enough to make sure that we're not taking steps backwards financially. So today, I think that there's a lot of growers that they know that there's a huge demand, that are very willing to learn to adopt these practices. But we have to make sure that the credits that we're receiving are verifiable, that the growers are actually getting paid for these practices, because we're the ones that are assuming a lot of these costs, and that those payments come quickly. If not, I think that growers will essentially lose interest because, like I said earlier, it's a lot of time and money and education spent on introducing some of these regenerative practices to our operations.
Gotcha. Yeah, it's certainly not simple and straightforward, is it?
No, yeah, sorry, just a quick comment. That is so spot on. And the market has to make it a whole lot more interesting for farmers to change their behavior. Otherwise, it's going to be a niche group that is, willing to really give it a try. The market has to come and intermediate in a much more compelling way. That's an excellent point.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to start to bring in some of the questions that have been coming in through the Q&A box from the audience. And I'd like to sort of build on that, the question of, making sure the market is providing more financial incentive to the growers. And I think a question for David, we talked a little bit about non-carbon benefits here, although our focus is climate mitigation, but obviously agriculture has a lot to offer in non-carbon benefits. Can those benefits also be actually accounted for, verified, credited, sold, and in a way drive more value?
Yes, they can. And so there's a couple of ways you can do that, but what folks mostly like to use is essentially tagging or labeling your carbon credit. So you would have a carbon credit But if you add another certification like the Sustainable Development Verified Impact Standard, which we also manage, you can actually tell a story about this carbon credit, which generates a real emission removal, but also achieves some of the sustainable development goals. You could also use the Climate Community Biodiversity Standards, which we also manage, or you can use like standards like the Gold Standard, which actually integrates them both. I don't know that they have any agricultural methodologies per se, but there are ways of quantifying and reporting on the non-carbon benefits, which actually are becoming increasingly important because people are starting to realize that these credits, these investments, really are generating a lot of other benefits beyond carbon.
Great, that's helpful. We got a couple of technical questions in. So we had a question about how do we quantify the carbon captured when multiple practices are employed and at different intervals, such as seasonal cover cropping or rotations? So I can speak to that a little bit, and then David or Casey, if either of you want to jump in here. With the new methodologies like the one that Vera adopted last year, the idea is you sort of step back from looking at individual practices and you look at the farm, and through soil sampling and biogeochemical modeling, and then aggregating many farms together, you can set baselines based on the historical practices and then measure the current year's activity with that in a way that allows it to adapt to the farmer changing their practices to what makes the most sense and can drive the most emission reductions. And you're simply capturing the change in the system, the fluxes of nitrous oxide, methane, soil carbon throughout each sort of cultivation year. And in that way, you can be more adaptable and you can have different farmers that are doing different things and it can change over time. David, anything to add to that?
No, I think you captured it well. I would just encapsulate saying, it's essentially based on modeling with extensive ground truthing, right? So, a model is only as good as the data that goes into it, but you need to make sure that it is actually generating real data. And so you need to ground truth that. But I think that gets to the question of like, the cost of this. And so as science gets more sophisticated, this is the kind of a great part where it will actually help to contribute to this, where we will understand, to a greater and more confident degree, where we can actually rely on models and other data sets without having to go to the ground and measure. Or we'll have maybe technologies that actually are able to measure the carbon and do that in a more automated way. So this is all kind of a very exciting space where we're seeing a lot of developments that will help to reduce the transaction costs for these projects. But in the end of the day, us as a certification body, we need to have that proof, that demonstration that actually the carbon has been stored in the soil in order to issue the credit. So it does end up being pretty complicated and costly, but that's just currently with what we have, but that's kind of how it works.
Yeah, and there was another question around soil sampling and about when the carbon measurements are taken, and it's expensive, right? Soil sampling. So, currently what we're doing in our project and what other projects are doing, you dig a soil core to at least 30 centimeters down, a foot or more, and send it to a lab for dry combustion analysis and testing. There are other technologies though on the horizon, things like spectroscopy, where we could potentially have lower cost sensors, rapid in-field measurements. And the key there is around the science, bringing down the uncertainty and bringing up the accuracy of these methods so that they can be incorporated. Luckily, the policy frameworks are already there to sort of accept these methods, because you just need to be able to control for the accuracy and uncertainty in your accounting. So once they become sort of accurate enough and financially viable, projects will go ahead and start to incorporate those into their system. I'm curious, Casey, if you guys have had any soil sampling done on your farm, either through Indigo or for other reasons.
Yeah, so I'm going to answer that in two different ways. We do soil sample every third year on our operation. That's always been a practice that we've had, just to make sure that we're keeping the fertility rates of the farm up, and we're always building those from a agronomic standpoint, yield standpoint. We have worked with Indigo during the verification process of our practice changes to verify the carbon emissions that we had pulled out of the atmosphere. we had looked at, like you talked about earlier, the different modeling. So some farms that we that had been, no-till for 30 plus years, and then some farms that we were transitioning to no-till, and utilizing the history and then what the practice change that we had completed to see how those soil samples compared. We also provided a lot of data when we talk about high quality credits. I think that's where Indigo has really separated themselves. The process that I went through as a grower to do a 5-year look back and basically provide any information for the individual fields that I was enrolling in the program was very in depth. There was a lot of questions that were asked. They pretty much wanted to know anything and everything about what we had done on those farms in the past, and then as we move into the future, what commitments we were making. So I do think if I put myself in a buyer's shoe, I can speak just from a grower side of things that there were no leaves unturned, and it was a very thorough process to go through.
Yeah, absolutely. That history of the field is really important. Sometimes we think about it as, well, there's just some carbon there and then you want to add to it, but the field is not stable. It's in constant state of flux, right? And the soil could be trending one way or the other. And so the key is to get that flux to trend upwards in terms of emission reduction and storage. Michael, there's a couple of questions that have come in that I think might be in your wheelhouse. So one question around, is there enough carbon credit flow that we could foresee this becoming accessible to individual investors through investment vehicles like mutual funds, pooled security portfolios, et cetera? You have thoughts there?
Yes. Am I muted? No. So yes, no, the answer to that question is yes. And therein lies, I mean, to the degree our capital markets, if the market grows in size as is anticipated, our systematic or systemic way of allocating capital should really kick in. And that's one, it's not just corporates, it's not just big Microsoft and Google and this and that. I think you will see a much more robust capital allocation set of activities, including that, or exchanges, or, yes, there should be, the capital will flow as if the market structure along the lines we've been discussing, happens and scales and verification and all the rest. Yes. Short answer, yes.
Great. Do you see, as you think about capital flowing into the carbon markets and actually driving real change, what do you think is sort of the key element? Is it price? I mean, is it just having a higher price would make this function better, or is it more nuanced than that?
Well, it's more nuanced than that. Pricing obviously is huge. I would say more on the supply side, per Casey's earlier discussions, that obviously pricing needs to go up on these carbon credits in order to drive behavior that will, in simple demand and supply terminology, will provide enough product for the capital markets to pick up on. So yeah, pricing is expected to go way up as the quality and the measurement and all these things we're talking about hopefully advance.
Great. We had a question here. Somebody's interested in how startups can engage more, specifically around making the market more attractive for farmers. And so I'm curious, Casey, you spoke to the need for education as being really important in information flowing. Do you see any specific thoughts around agronomic services and where startups, somebody starting a new company, could be helpful?
Yeah, I think, we constantly see new tools and technologies that are coming down the pipeline. The ag space is really big right now, which is really exciting to be working in that and see that there's, a lot of the private sector is taking a huge interest in that right now. We work with a lot of startup companies and also, the companies that have been part of the industry for many, many years on what could benefit us as we move into the future. being a young grower, I think that technology can play a huge piece in many different sectors of the ag industry. Data is huge, and being able to capture that data and verify that data and make quick decisions off of the data that we're able to pull off of our individual fields, whether that's from an agronomic standpoint, allows me to, with more confidence, scale the number of acres that we're farming. So today, my biggest holdup is we're set up where I feel confident that from a geographical standpoint, we could farm a larger footprint. The problem is that as we move farther and farther away from our home operation, is that I want to make sure that I'm still giving fields that are farther mileage away the same TLC that I'm giving of the fields right out my back door. And with that, from a carbon or sustainability standpoint, just any tools that are allowing us to track and or monitor those fields and collect data on those fields that are easily deployed and easily managed and aren't a huge cost. They're not a huge additional cost to our operation, and or if they are, they bring a larger benefit. I think would be a large player for startups and introducing themselves in the production ag community.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, the data collection, as you've noted a couple times, is really intense, and is something that will get better over time. I think adding to that, one thing we've seen, data interoperability being really key. That as somebody creates a new, sensor or a new, data collection platform, make sure that it works with the protocols and with the projects that you're trying to support, because otherwise you can end up creating a lot of extra work as different software systems try to talk to each other, and it ends up not solving the problems and the pain points for the farmer. Audrey, I've got another question for you. So I'm thinking about, the simple question here is, how do you buy offsets, right? A company like Blue Bottle, how do you guys engage with the carbon market? Do you just go online and put them in your shopping cart, or what's the process that you go through?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we've been able to work directly with Indigo, but for other credits as well. There's there are climate consultants out there who can guide you, but really you're looking at the registries and you can see a project, the background of the project when you're in purchasing, and look at information like what the co-benefits are that I discussed earlier, in addition to the tons that you're looking to purchase. So you can get an idea of the geography, the industry, and align to possibly a specific part of your business where you want to focus, whether that's electricity or ag or other nature-based climate solutions. But there are climate consultants out there, but really they're helping you make a decision based on credits that are available on these registries.
Got you. David, did you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think what we're seeing right now in the market is an evolution from an over-the-counter kind of very bespoke kind of agreements of the kind that Audrey is describing, to what you will see in the future. I think as the market grows and becomes more sophisticated, and there are more tools available, it will become less of a burden and less of a high bar, right? So I imagine that Blue Bottle did quite a bit of due diligence to kind of zone in on the kinds of credits that you wanted. And that's great, but not everybody has the ability to do that. And over time, I think, and we see efforts like the Task Force for Scaling Voluntary Markets, they're trying to make this be more of a market that it doesn't require you to be an expert in the topic in order to dive into it. So that will be an interesting evolution. I think will help scale the market and bring more finance to it.
While you've got the floor, I'm going to circle back to one thing I think we didn't make clear at the beginning. When does a carbon credit become a carbon offset?
When it is used is what would be my answer. So you have a carbon credit, it exists in the market, it can be traded, but the moment that the end buyer, the company, if you will, that's going to use it to offset its residual emissions, that's when it becomes an offset. And so that's when, essentially, when that company retires that unit, meaning that it takes it out of circulation. It says, I'm using it, and nobody else can use it, and our registry makes sure that it gets logged as being retired, nobody else can use it. We already prevented double counting, but then that means nobody else can use that credit for any other purposes. So that's why I would say is when a carbon credit turns into an offset. But
great.
Yeah.
I think that's so important when we talk about high quality and the need for rigorous standards, is to remind ourselves that it's an emission reduction until, as you say, somebody uses it, and then another emission goes up, right? It's balancing something else in most cases. And so it's really key that we get the reduction part of it right. So we're at time. We're going to wrap up now. I really want to thank all the panelists. This was a super interesting discussion. I hope we've left everybody with a sense of optimism about what can be done and the scale and pace that we're moving into. And I hope everybody looks at their breakfast a little bit differently and wonders about what could happen on the field.
Thank you.
Thank you, Max, and thank you to all our panelists as well. That's a lovely note to end on. Start thinking about your breakfast a little bit more. The recordings will be out to you in the next couple of days. Yeah, if you'd like to know any more information with regards to Indigo, there'll be some contact details in that email to yourself as well. Thank you all for listening, and thank you all again to our panelists and Max. Look forward to seeing you next time. Cheers. Bye.
Thank you.
Cheers. Bye.
Thanks.